All right, Matt, welcome to the Charlie Vinch Show. I have Matt Thornton here, the owner of SBG, the founder of SBG. He is a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, 4th degree under Chris Hedier.
Howder.
And Hedier?
Howder.
Yeah,
you got it. Close.
I apologize.
All right.
Matt, tell me, what is SBG?
SBG stands for Straight Blast Gym. And my background, as you probably know, was in Jeet-Kune-Do concepts. So I was actually a Jeet-Kune-Do instructor in the very late 80s, early 90s that then came across Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and started thinking about what I call aliveness, which is why some things work and why some things don't work. So my obsession, even from a very early age with martial arts, was what works in fights and what doesn't work in fights. That's pretty much the only thing that's ever motivated me about martial arts. And I was fortunate to run across Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, courtesy of Fabio Santos and Rickson Gracie, Rickson being my first coach. And that led me to a different path from Jeet-Kune-Do, and I opened up my first school. And my first school, what I wanted to do was take the stuff that we were doing. Well, this was a little before MMA, right after the first UFC. And I wanted to take the stuff that we were doing and test it. And so the only one of the few techniques that we kept from the Jeet-Kune-Do curriculum was a straight blast, a technique called a straight blast. We used it differently. We used it more as a boxing blast, which Vitor Belfort kind of made famous later on. But we kept that. And so the name, we took the term straight blast, which was one of the techniques we kept from Jeet-Kune-Do. And then I used the word gym as opposed to academy or institute, because the idea was this was a place where you're going to come and we're going to actually sweat, we're going to work out, we're going to train. It's not about clicking sticks together, it's not about collecting certificates. We're going to learn how to fight. And so I called it Straight Blast Gym. And from that time, I think it's known more these days, thanks to our fighters, by the acronym SBG, but initially that's what it started as.
Wow, and you have a lot of well-known fighters under SBG. Can you just name a few for the listeners?
Conor McGregor is probably our most famous. He's the trained from beginning to now with my second black belt ever, which is John Kavanagh in Ireland. Forrest Griffin was a student from beginning all the way through of Adam Singer, who was one of my first instructors in the United States that hadn't come from my own school in Portland, Oregon. He also, of course, trained Brian Bowles. Chris Connolly out of Alabama currently has multiple guys fighting in the UFC, including Eric and, of course, Big Walt, both of whom fought on the last card. So we've had quite a few. In my early days, when in the late 90s, I worked quite a bit with Randy Couture and Dan Henderson, and some of those guys would come into my gym and train. So we were more of an MMA school in Portland early on. And in my personal journey, I just kind of gravitated more towards jiu-jitsu just because I love jiu-jitsu. It's not to say I still have an MMA team. We still teach the stand-up clinch and ground. We teach the whole thing. It's just my personal, love became Brazilian jiu-jitsu. And some of the other coaches in SBG, of which there's many, I have 30-something black belts.
Wow.
Some of them are more MMA-oriented, like John, Kavanagh, who runs probably Europe's biggest MMA gym right now. And some of them are more jiu-jitsu oriented, and some of them, like Coach Paul Sharp or Coach Ray Price, also focus a lot on self-defense and law enforcement training. So we have people in SBG who focus on different aspects of what we do.
I come from a JKD background too. Me and you talked a little bit about this before. Can you tell us what was your reasoning or thought process to kind of migrate away from that as a full system and to kind of do this SBG thing as a whole now?
Sure. The early philosophy of Straight Blast Gym was basically designed as a counterpoint to the hypocrisy and my own personal disillusionment with what I saw in the Jeet-Kune-Do world. So I gravitated towards Jeet-Kune-Do because of the idea of fighting at all the different ranges. And I had a boxing background. And when I first moved here to Portland, I spent several years focused mostly on boxing. But I'd also been in some fights in school and after school where I'd been tackled and just had somebody sit on my chest, UFC 1 style. And I knew you needed all the ranges, and they talked a good game about training all the ranges. And some of them, were way ahead of their time. Like, for example, Larry Hartzell and some of the others. Hal Faulkner was actually one of the first Americans ever to train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Not a lot of people know, but he was an instructor in Jeet Kune Do as well from the old Kali Academy days. And he actually started training Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in the 70s and came back to the States and tried to tell people about it. But I think he ran into the same thing I did, which was after I met Hickson and watched him tap out a room full of judo black belts without using his hands. I came back to the academy where I was teaching, and I told everybody about what had happened and what I'd seen. And I could tell immediately they just really weren't interested. And they were interested. They were motivated by a different thing than I was motivated by. And I was thinking a lot at the time about what works and what doesn't work. And there are aspects of the Jeet Kune Do curriculum that, of course, work. For example, Muay Thai and boxing, those obviously work. There are good things in the Jun Fan kickboxing, some of the stuff that Bruce Lee came up with that's connected and associated with fencing. I think the best example you'll ever see of that in action is going to be Conor McGregor, who kind of personifies that kind of fighting style where related to speed and accuracy. So there are good things there, but there's also a lot of nonsense, absolute nonsense, where they were doing things that were ridiculous. And what I did not like is the fact that they would not differentiate what they were doing to the students. And I would hear them talk behind the scenes about how many of them knew, but when they were teaching, they didn't want to express it. There's this idea that all arts have something good to offer, this very relativistic philosophy, which is false. And anybody that's coached functional martial arts knows sometimes when you get a student from a traditional martial art like Aikido or something else, fantasy-based art, Wing Chun, all you wind up with is a lot of habits that you have to retrain. They wind up being much harder to teach than somebody that comes to you with a blank slate. And I found it very cynical. I found it cynical to lie to people and to teach things that didn't work, even when you know they don't work. And when pressed on it, it's all testable, right? What we do is empirical. That's one of the beautiful things about martial arts. Like Sam Harris, the writer, has said, martial arts make delusion physical. It's delusion manifest. I mean, you can see it. And so unlike a lot of delusions out there, we can physically prove it doesn't work. And with something like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, you can do it gently. You don't have to beat people up to do it. And even in light of that new evidence, they would not change their mind or change their beliefs. And that's when I realized, okay, this is not my community. This is not what I want to do. And so I started SBG.
Do you think that there's a lot of that still going on right now? And if there is a lot of that still going on right now, even outside of the JKD world, like you said, you pulled a lot of great stuff from there, and I have too. Why do people keep going to it? Is it this disillusion is it like a fantasy where it's like it's a dream and they want it to be real so bad that they make it real in their own mind? Is that what it is?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And it's hard question to answer. Certainly a hard question to answer across the board, because I think different people have different reasons for doing it. Sometimes it's the Concord fallacy, and they've just invested decades in something, and then to come and have somebody turn around and tell them, hey, that's all make-believe. Pretty hard to do. Like, I have a friend of mine, Rokas, who has a big YouTube channel, who was an Aikido instructor who decided to test his Aikido one day and against MMA. And the result was what we know would happen. And he changed his mind. And he closed his Aikido school, which was a successful Aikido school. And he started a new journey and actually moved to Ireland for a while and trained with Kavanaugh, and came out here to the States with me and lived for 3 months and trained here. And I have a great deal of respect for that, because that's super hard to do. And so when people get called on that, they have a choice. Do I change my belief system in light of new evidence, or do I just double down? I don't believe it's ever healthy for people to double down, but a lot of people do. So that's one reason. Another reason is they're just not motivated by what works. Rokas was obviously motivated by what works or what doesn't work, because he was willing to test what he does. Like, why would you do that? Why would you put yourself up against an MMA person if you weren't interested in the truth?
Right.
And if you're not interested in the truth, then nothing anybody's going to say to you is going to change your mind. I mean, if somebody wants to believe the world is flat, you're not going to be able to convince them the world's not flat if that's what they want to believe. So there's some of that too.
Bias. Confirmation bias.
Absolutely. And sometimes it's just faulty reasoning. So I have, we have our own Straight Blast Gym podcast, and I had last month I had a talk with a friend of mine, Burton Richardson, who you probably know is a pretty famous Jeet Kune Do instructor.
I don't. Tell me about him.
He's been around for a long time. I think he started Jeet Kune Do around the same time as Paul Vunak, which would have been in the 70s.
Okay, so maybe the same time as my instructor.
Yeah. He's of that generation. He still teaches it. He's been around for a long time, although he focuses on functional aspects. We became friends when I first broke away from Jeet Kune Do and first opened up my gym, and he was the only Jeet Kune Do instructor, with the exception of some other guys that weren't really well known, that supported my decision. Said, "Yeah, you should do that." Everybody else either told me I was wrong and I shouldn't say it, or I shouldn't say what I'm saying, or they had a very cynical view in that, well, you'll never make money that way, right? You're never going to be able to support. People don't want to sweat. People don't want to really work out. People want to click sticks and get certificates and collect feathers in their cap, so to speak, which again, I find cynical and negative. Anyway, Bert's still around that community in a way that I am not. I haven't really been around that community in probably 20 years. And I don't think I'd spoken to Bert since 2000. So he and I hadn't spoken for probably 19, 20 years, other than Facebook messages or texts. And I asked him that question, and he's like, yeah, it's gotten better. So you can go to the Inosanto Academy and you can take Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu classes and things like that now. So there's some of that. Yep. But at the same time, you have people now that are gravitating towards something that's like Systema. And if I tried to design a martial art that was more ridiculous, I couldn't come up with anything sillier than Systema. And so, it's still very much, they're still very lost. And there's always been a few people who were the exception to the rule, like Eric Paulson, who was a great fighter. I think he was a great fighter.
Oh, yeah.
But Eric was training Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, started maybe a little before I did. So he's good at Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. He's good at wrestling. He's a good striker. He has good kickboxing, which is what he used, So to answer your question, yes, I still think there's lots of that. I think there's always going to be lots of that. I never went into this anticipating that I was going to change everybody's mind in the world. The only thing I want to accomplish is if somebody's out there and hears this podcast or is listening to me and they are sincerely interested in the truth, that I'm planting the seed of doubt that is going to motivate them to go on their own journey and ask and seek for evidence and follow that where it leads. And if I do that, which I believe I do for some people, then I will be happy with what I've accomplished.
And nothing truer could be, said than what you just said. I had a very similar experience myself, even as somebody who had a good JKD background. My stand-up was great. It was even hard for purple belts to take me down who didn't have a martial arts background besides Jiu-Jitsu. I could keep them off all day and probably knock them out. Now, here's where I fell short. Very similar story. I'm sparring with a guy who was an Olympian wrestler. He never really had a martial arts background, but he was from a farm and his neck was like this.
Well, wrestling's martial art, but yeah.
Okay. So he didn't have like a traditional martial arts background. And when I got into the gym that day, the guy said, okay, you're going to spar with this guy. And I'm just like, I'll just stay on the outside. I'll outrun this dude and I'll just end up picking him apart. Well, what ended up happening is every time I picked him apart and I'd sit down on a punch, literally his head wouldn't move.
Right.
Okay. So now the theory of all fights start standing up. This is true. Yeah. I'll just knock him out. Not so true.
Right.
I gave this guy every shot I had. And when I tell you he put me on my back and there was no way I was getting up.
Yeah.
There was no way I was getting up. And I realized right then and there, I have to learn something that while I'm on my back that I can at least survive, because if I was on the street and that had happened to me, I would have been dead.
Yes.
I would have been dead.
Yeah. Yeah. So many people have had that experience, right?
And it's a good experience. I'd rather would have had it in the gym than out there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, you know, when I came back and I told people about that, the Jeet Kune Do people, one of the things at the time, I don't think it's so prevalent now because this was before the UFC, so before the first UFC, before Hoist had fought, and now so many people have access to MMA. But at that time, before Hoist fought, these guys had it in their mind that, well, they're never going to get in, they're never going to get on the inside, they're never going to be able to get the takedown, and you know, there was so much emphasis put on entering, right? Kicking to punching to trapping to grab, as if entering was really hard to do. When in reality, as we all know, the hardest thing in the world to do is to keep somebody like that guy from just grabbing you and throwing you onto the ground.
Or just having a person who, you know, is so tough,
Yeah.
you know, too tough for their own good,
Yeah.
that every shot you give this person, and if that's the only ammo you have, and once your ammo's out, they keep barreling after you.
Yeah.
And you get a hold around your stomach and they pick you up over their head, and now your head is in towards the concrete. You're in trouble.
Yeah.
You're
Oh,
in
yeah.
a lot of trouble. Now,
Yeah.
let's be honest. Is everybody on the street like that? Absolutely not. But you could run into that person.
And that's the person you should be training for.
Amen.
Yeah.
Amen. And we can always take stuff, like you said. There's always good to take from some martial arts and others not. So now that we're talking about that, your jiu-jitsu background now, how did you get hooked up with Chris? Like, how did you guys get connected?
Yeah. So my first experience with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I wind up telling the story a lot just because it's kind of an origin story. So people always ask me. And what happens is I don't want people to think that the majority of my training was from Rickson. From blue belt, after I received my blue belt, all the way to now, my coach has been Chris Howder. But what happened was early on, I ran into Fabio Santos. Fabio is a black belt under, I think he got his black belt under Holes Gracie, Rickson's older brother, who was known to be the family champion at the time in Brazil. And then he'd migrated. I think he married an American woman. I hope I'm not messing up his origin story, but he married an American woman, migrated to Oregon, and he was building sailboats, I believe. He wasn't teaching. And Horian called him up about a year or so before the first UFC when they were, and I remember back then there was these rumors of this pit fighting, or they were going to dig a hole and have guys fighting and stuff. There was these rumors floating around of this competition that was going to be coming up. And Horian knew, of course, because they've run this experiment so many times before, what the result was going to be. And he knew his school was going to be flooded with new students. And so he called Fabio up and he said, hey, man, get ready because I want to have a job for you. I want you to come down here and work for me in Torrance. So Fabio's way of getting ready was, pre-internet, it was to put an ad in the little local newspaper offering to pay $50 to anybody that could come beat him up.
What? $50 back then, man.
That's a lot of money.
A lot of money.
One of my JKD buddies, John Daniels, said, sure, I'll go do it, right? Because he was a boxer. And he told me about it. And I'm like, yeah, I'll do it. I get beat up every single day at the boxing gym. And I'm paying $5 a month to get beat up down there. Get $50 to try to get beat up. That's great. So the results were what you would expect them to be. You know, Fabio would just clinch and take down. He's not a big man. And even then, I think he was maybe 40 at the time. I think Fabio must be in his 60s now. I hope I'm not aging you, Fabio, but.
Were you allowed to punch him during that match? Could you punch him?
Well, I had gloves on. He's like, hey, punch me. He is actually a super nice man. So as soon as that happened to me, I mean, I wasn't an idiot. I wasn't trying to beat him up over and over again. He showed me that once and I'm like, I want to learn from you. And I brought him into the school and I did a few privates with him. And I remember what they were. He showed me a triangle. He showed me the guard. If you wind up on your back, this is what you want to be. Gave me some principles. He said a few things to me in those first lessons that I still haven't forgotten, like jiu-jitsu is about learning to when to use energy and when to save energy. And you know, of course, the ubiquitous, you got to relax and that kind of stuff. And then Horian hired him. And so he moved from Portland. And around that same time, somewhere in there, and I'm terrible with chronology, but somewhere in that time, a little before or after, I had my encounter with Rickson, where one of my Jeet Kune Do friends in Oregon had brought him up for a seminar. And just to give you an idea of how early this was, I think there was only like 20 or 30 people there, which is hard to imagine Rickson doing a seminar and having 20 or 30 people. And when I walked in, half of them were judo guys, judo black belts, big wrestlers. And I was at the time a bit intimidated by grapplers because I knew I had no functional grappling skill other than what I learned in Jeet Kune Do, which wasn't functional. And in the Jeet Kune Do guys in the sweatpants and the wrestling shoes like me. And Rickson did what I told you. He wrestled all of them without using his hands and tapped them all out. He pulled one hand out for me. He didn't need it, but he did. And then I went and grabbed his head and tried to squeeze as hard as I could because I didn't know what else to do. We were starting on the knees. And he arm locked me with one arm. And after that, I was a convert. This is what I want to do. And so I brought Rickson up to Oregon. He stayed one time. I think he was here for 10 or 12 days. I opened up my own school. I partnered with a judo black belt named Craig Bell. He brought Rickson up. I was able to stay at Craig's house and get to spend time with Rickson, train. Rickson gave me the blue belt and told me I could teach, because my only reason, to be honest with you, when I opened up my own gym, my only reason for teaching was to create training partners, because I wanted people to train with. And all the Jeet Kune Do people were telling me you'll never make money. And I thought, okay, I'll never make money, but I'm not going to teach something I don't think is true. And I want training partners. So I asked Rickson, the stuff you're showing me, I have to show it to other people so I can train. And he gave me his permission to do that. I went and competed once in LA. And while I was down there, Rickson this was a year or so later, Rickson had then become hard to meet up with. I mean, he was fighting in Japan. He had become famous. It was really hard to get a hold of and train with. And while I was down there, Burton Richardson, actually, if I remember correctly, introduced me to Chris Howder. And Chris was one of the first 12 Americans to get a black belt. He was a black belt under Higa Machado. And Chris, and I liked Chris immediately. We hit it off. He's articulate. Obviously, he was not only a few years older than me, so he's always been a little bit like an older brother to me. And he was the first person I ever met, other than Fabio, who was super open with the knowledge. He would, whatever question I would have about jiu-jitsu, he would answer it in detail without keeping any secrets. He was also one of the only black belts I knew, American black belts that I knew that would roll with anybody. So he would come up to Portland and Chris is not a big guy. He's about 150. I mean, back then he was probably 145 because he was great shape. And he'd roll with Randy Couture. He'd roll with Dan Henderson. He'd roll with them for an hour, 2 hours. He'd do MMA with them. And some of the other black belts that I have come up wouldn't do it for, maybe some of it was, don't want to roll with Randy Couture and get potentially tapped out. And some of it was politics. As people nowadays, it's hard to imagine. But back then, if you trained with one guy in LA, if you were a Machado student, you weren't supposed to go train with a Rickson student, vice versa. So Chris didn't care about that. So he would train with anybody. He would share their knowledge. So he became my coach, and has been ever since. And I got my black belt from him. I think it was the end of 2001.
Wow.
So 19 years ago, I guess.
That's a while ago. That's an awesome story, man. So many figures from, jiu-jitsu that you just mentioned there, who are pivotal characters in or people, I should say, not character, people in the evolution of jiu-jitsu in America in general. Like all those, Rickson, Fabio, and Chris. Like those are.
If you were training back in the 90s, you were bound to run into, there just wasn't that many of them now. Now there's jiu-jitsu school in every town. Back then you had to go to Southern California really, or New York where Renzo was. And I think that was just about it.
So Steve Maxwell, my coach's coach, Phil Miglioris and Ricardo Miglioris, were some of Steve Maxwell's first students. And Steve Maxwell, I believe, was in Philadelphia before Renzo was actually even in New York.
Cool. Okay. Nice.
So
I remember there was a school in Philadelphia, and I actually remember seeing some challenge matches from down there.
And Phil and Rick were doing the challenge matches not only in Torrance in California at the Gracie Academy, but they have videos, if you go on YouTube, of them doing the challenge matches with Steve Maxwell at Maxercise.
Did they bring in Hoyce once to do a
Hoyce
challenge?
was there, Helson was there, Hoyler came in, all these guys came in.
Yeah, I think I met him. He actually came to, I remember him, he came to the Jeet Kune Do school I was teaching at in Portland and showed me a video of him doing a challenge match. wrestled with some big guys. I think it may have been the Sayat Kali guys had come in to challenge him, and he submitted them. But then they said the guy said he's going to come back and bring his bigger brother, who was like 300 pounds, and they flew Hoist in. And he had a video of it. He showed me the video. It was like Hoist submitted him a couple times, I think, with triangles and arm locks. Yeah, that's very cool. I forgot about those guys.
Pretty cool, right?
Yeah.
All right. So now we have the background on the SBG and the striking. So we don't want this podcast to seem like, guys, that JKD didn't work or that striking didn't work, because there's a lot of things in just playing jiu-jitsu that we could say, hey, maybe that wouldn't be great for a street fight or MMA. So what do you do with your students so they have complements from both of these and they become a well-rounded martial artist, effective fighter, and that we're not so thinking in one direction or the other?
Sure. It's a good question. So this is where functional martial arts and philosophy and science actually connect. So if we're talking about critical thinking, or we're talking about the scientific method, the answer isn't as important as the way you arrive at the answer. The epistemology is the key to arriving at correct answers. If you have an accurate epistemology, you can problem solve for yourself, come up with functional answers that will admit to a connection to reality, that are going to be a measurement that is likely to admit to ever increasing complexity, right? So this is the case with martial arts. So the epistemology is what's important. And the epistemology in martial arts that work is aliveness. It's an opponent process. It is a resisting training partner. And without that aliveness, timing, energy, and motion, and I'm not talking about sparring. Sparring is alive, but drilling as well. When we drill in SBG, it's always alive. So when we're just teaching and showing technique, we call that the introduction stage, and then you drill it. That's aliveness with adaptive resistance, so people don't get hurt. And that is the key to understanding what works and what doesn't work in fighting. Every functional martial art has aliveness, and every functional martial art, not coincidentally, tends to also be a sport, which is why it had aliveness. Because in sports and in the military and in businesses, and anytime result matters, anytime the result matters, you're going to go to an opponent process. You're going to go to some form of meritocracy that's based on an opponent process. And the scientific method is the opponent process, right? If I'm a biologist and let's say I'm a virologist, I'm coming up with a vaccine, and I believe I have that vaccine. I have to test that multiple times, and then those tests have to be evaluated by people who are qualified to evaluate them, and repeated by people who are qualified to repeat them, to be proven. And in science, other people are constantly trying to disprove your hypothesis, right? It is the scientific method, when it's done correctly at its best, is a ruthless form of competition. There's no room in there to say, oh, I want to be nice, so I'm going to not tear down this person's hypothesis, because what people are supposed to be interested in is the truth. And so it is with martial arts. And so all I've ever criticized from day one until now has been training methods. Those training methods are connected to humans, so people tend to get emotional about it. But I'm not talking about specific individuals, and I'm not talking about even specific arts. I'm talking about the training method. So that's the training method. The curriculum, I believe, needs to be focused around fundamentals. There is fundamentals of jiu-jitsu, like my style as a black belt, being 6'8" and 272 pounds and 51, is going to be different from your style, which is going to be different from a female who's 120 pounds and 63. But underlying all of it, assuming we're all legitimate black belts, is going to be a structural foundation of fundamentals, which more or less we all do the same way. And it's those fundamentals of the delivery system: stand-up, clinch, and ground. So the solid boxing, striking fundamentals that revolve around footwork and body mechanics. Solid clinch fundamentals that you would draw from Greco and from Muay Thai and folk style and all functional judo, all the functional grappling clinch arts, and solid ground fighting skills. So at the end of the day, what we do in jiu-jitsu, if we're doing it scientifically, isn't Brazilian, it's not Japanese, it's not Canadian. There's no such thing as Canadian geometry. It's going to be universal. It's going to transcend culture. It's going to transcend era. It's going to be the same 100 years from now as it was during the time of the Greeks. It's going to transcend body style, uniform. If your game falls apart when you take the gi off or you put the gi on, you don't have a game based around fundamentals. And so what we try and do in SBG is we're training with aliveness in a way that's healthy so people don't get hurt and so everybody can train. And we're focused on fundamentals. And I try and really, myself especially, restrict myself only to fundamentals. And then through the alive training and the rolling on the mat, each individual student will develop their own style. And at the end of the day, as you well know, every black belt is going to be very different from every other black belt. They'll all have very different styles, same fundamentals, but very different ways of applying them. And then it becomes their time to teach. And the temptation, unfortunately, I see too often, is to teach your style, to teach the way you do it, the moves that you're good at, which happens a lot in jiu-jitsu, I think mostly because people aren't taught how to teach. And what I think and what we believe at SBG is you want to then go back and focus on the fundamentals with your student and give them an opportunity to develop their own style. And the irony is, the more you focus on fundamentals, the more freedom you actually give your students to play and come up with their own setups, their own preferences. So the combination of those things, an epistemology that revolves around aliveness and a curricula that revolves around fundamentals, when combined, create people who can learn how to fight. And it's the same whether we're talking about handguns, hand grenades, grappling with a gi, or fighting in a cage.
Wow, that's beautifully put. I wanted to catch you before you started on the of breaking down of we want the result. I have a question for you because you're a very well read person and everything. So with this, and this I'm curious for me too. We want the result, right? That's what we're there for. No matter what it is, martial arts or not, we want the result. Okay. Do you think, I feel people get so caught up in, well, why does it work? And I read this study and this thing and that thing and this thing and that thing. And this person says this and this person says that, where it's like, listen, the result says this, just fucking do what the result says to do and just fucking do it. Don't worry about why it works. Just fucking do it.
Right.
If you want the result, just do it. Why do you have to think about why it works? It does. Yes?
Yes and no. So I understand completely. I mean, teaching has been my full-time job now for 30 years. I understand completely where you're coming from. But my longer answer to that is yes and no. So in the beginning, when a student first comes to train, a brand new white belt, the best thing they can do, assuming they're at a good school, and I would give people things that they should look for to make sure that they're at a good school, a place where the instructors are patient, articulate, a mat where you see people of different ages, men and women, a place where you feel comfortable, a place where people aren't getting hurt, and a place where the students compete and they do well, they're competitive. You find a school like that, the instructor's credible, he's good. This has been a repeated experiment now, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, for quite a while. We don't need to prove it works anymore. Then the best thing you can do is be quiet and listen to what your instructor says. Just listen to what your instructor says. Empty your cup, as you say. Mm. As you progress, and not while the instructor's teaching and trying to get the information across to you, but afterwards when you go home or when you think about jiu-jitsu, and people, as you know, and I'm sure the way as you are, people who love jiu-jitsu, you're thinking about it all the time, right? You come home and you're thinking about, how does the triangle work? How does this work? I actually think that intellectual exercise is very important. And ultimately what students have to do is, and everybody who's good at jiu-jitsu ends up doing this one way or another, is they have to build a model in their brain that makes sense to them in an engineering way as far as how jiu-jitsu works. And if you don't do that, you'll never be able to answer your own questions, right? It's the difference between handing somebody a fish every day or teaching them how to fish.
Interesting.
So I do think that teaching people how to think critically about martial arts, teaching people how to problem solve, encouraging questions, encouraging at the right moment, a lot of introspection about how the art works and how it's applied. I actually think that's super important. But the caveat there is that you, in class, especially when you're new and you haven't been training a long time, the best thing you can do is just trust what your instructor says, because there's going to be so much that you don't yet understand. And the faster you just put your confidence in your coach and just do what he says, the faster you will actually arrive at your answer. So it's a dichotomy, and there's a balance there, I think, that has to be struck.
That was really well said. I think you took like exactly what I was thinking and put it into words where, you know, I think I was saying, can people overthink what they're doing too? Can they just like totally mind fuck themselves?
Yes. And we call that analysis paralysis. And that happens quite a bit. But you know, that happens a lot less when you're training with aliveness, because when you're drilling, even when you're drilling in an SBG class, even as a white belt, you're going to be working against somebody who's really, there's timing, energy, and motion. They're really giving you resistance. They're not being a uki. They're not being a dummy for you. And in that environment, you can't really operate and play the game if you're trying to consciously think about everything you're doing. You kind of have to let go and go with the flow, so to speak, and enter that flow state, which is one of the reasons why people love jiu-jitsu so much, whether they realize it or not. It tends to put people into the flow state. You go and roll for an hour. You're not thinking, and if it's a competitive roll, you're not thinking about problems with your boyfriend or girlfriend or the bills you have to pay. You're free of all that. And your body's doing the learning, and your mind is taking a back seat, your conscious mind. And that's a beautiful thing. So the more schools are training with aliveness, I think the analysis paralysis problem ultimately ends up solving itself.
How can we do how do you do the aliveness training without scaring the brand new person? Because we always hear and see, man, that looks really scary. Like, or somebody will come in and they'll do a partial live drill and they'll freak out about it. How do you do that without freaking somebody out?
You have really good qualified coaches. So for somebody that teaches at our gym, you don't get a purple belt or brown belt or black belt at SBG and then people say, go ahead, now you can teach. Because teaching in and of itself is a separate skill.
Amen.
And some of the worst coaches and worst teachers I've seen have been world champions, terrible teachers. And I've seen blue belts that were fantastic teachers. So I think the first thing you have to do is respect the skill of teaching as a art form and as a science in and of itself, number one. Then you have to teach your staff. So at our gym, they go through instructor training programs, and they are taught how to teach. And depending, it's usually about 40 hours, the first one. And the first one is just about how you present material. It's not even about the curriculum. And it's not about whether or not the student can do a triangle. It's about whether or not they can teach someone else to do a triangle. So we focus on that. And then once they graduate that class, they have to shadow another coach for at least 100 classes. And then after that, then maybe we put them on the schedule. And the key word when we're talking about drilling with aliveness, and this is one of the reasons why it annoys me when people equate it to sparring, the key word there is adaptive, right? So the thing I try and explain to students, and the sooner they learn this, the more enjoyable and the faster they'll learn jiu-jitsu or any functional martial art is, failure isn't just okay. Failure is an essential part of the process. If what you're doing doesn't incorporate a high degree of failure, you're not learning at as fast as you otherwise could be. And so the adaptive drill, the resistance that they're going up against, it shouldn't be so much that they're getting smashed and they can't do anything. And it definitely shouldn't be enough that they ever get hurt. That shouldn't happen. But there should be an element of failure. And that's important. And they learn that day one when they come to a straight blast gym. That's repeated over and over again by myself and by our staff. So they're coming in drilling and they're not expecting they're going to get hurt, and they're not scared because they can watch and see, this is a competent coach. His number one most important thing is the safety of the people on the mat. So he's not drilling with the students, or she's not drilling with the students. They're watching. They're making sure everybody's being cool. Nobody's getting hurt. That's number one. And everybody on the mat, including the black belts who are training in the same class as the white and blue belts, are failing. A good percentage of the time they're failing. Sometimes they're successful and sometimes they're not. And that is the sign of a good school. And in that kind of an environment, and I think the best word for it is culture. In that kind of culture, everybody that walks in should feel welcome and comfortable.
Mm. I couldn't have said it any better myself. I love the way that you said that. And just from, I'm a black belt now, but when I was a white belt, there's plenty of places I went to that didn't have that culture, and that really can scare somebody away or give them a bad first experience, forever. So
we didn't have that. You know, when I don't want people to get the wrong idea. This has been something that we have learned over the years. When I first opened up my school, we trained way too hard. And one of the things that I deeply regret is that I weeded out a lot of people. And I've talked about this before, but the worst part about that is the people that I weeded out were the people who needed jiu-jitsu the most. They're the ones who I want to teach now. The people who stayed with me were already tough. I mean, they may not have had any
make them any tougher, right?
Right. And that was a little bit stubborn, and that took me a lot longer than it should have to learn. But I don't think I was alone. I just think the culture of the way everybody trained jiu-jitsu and everybody trained MMA when the sport first birthed itself in the United States, it was way too rough in the sense of being counterproductive. But I do think that's changed a lot. You can see it's changed because when you look around and you travel around, you'll see mats. Like on my mat, you'll have people on my mat who are in their 60s training alongside people who are 21.
God bless. Yeah, I think that, like you said, that is a good indicator of a good school, all different age levels and skill levels. I want to talk about the notion of failing at something and how it can be productive for us as humans. So I have a daughter. She's 3 years old. And you have kids also, right?
5 kids.
You have a kid. Okay. Talk about, you have how many?
5.
You have 5 kids?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So then you can tell me. All right. So 5 kids.
Yep.
You implement this with culture-wise at your studio for the kids or for your children and even the adults, instilling in them early on, listen, it didn't go your way. You lost.
Yeah.
Instead of saying, no, it's okay. You still get a first prize. Tell me your thoughts on that whole thing, on how that works.
Yeah, that's super important. And that goes back to what I talked, why I use the word culture. Because really what you're doing is you're building a culture. And my opinion is the head coach of any gym, which is usually, in our business, is usually the owner of the gym. Mm-hmm. Your most important job, number one, is the safety of the people in your gym. That's number one. If you fail at that, you're an utter failure. And number two is creating a healthy culture. And a distant third is teaching them fighting. And I believe that's exactly the same with being a parent. Number one, as a parent, your job is to keep your kids safe. If you fail at that, nothing anybody else is going to say to you is going to matter to you if you're a good person. You will know you are a failure. Number two is, the culture that's around the kids, how you raise them to think about things like failure. So we homeschool. I have 2 grown boys and I have 3 smaller kids, two girls and a little boy. We homeschool the 2 girls and my son, he's only 3, but the 2 girls we homeschool, and we teach them about failure every single day, and they get frustrated. And that's fine. Being frustrated is part of it. It's what they do with that frustration and how they react to it that we respond to. And there's before I say any more, or even I say much more on this topic, there's a really good video that my first black belt to come out of my gym, Travis Davison, who's also the vice president of SBG, gave a talk at a tournament that he was running to the parents, really. He was talking to the parents in the stands about failure and about what you should say when your child comes up to you after they fail, and how it's so important that you don't make excuses for it. You don't tell them, oh, yeah, that wasn't your day. That kid's bigger than you. You were sick yesterday. No, that's not how you do it. You put your hand on them, you tell them you're proud of them, but you don't ever make excuses for their failure. And you don't ever want to give them a sense of entitlement. There's nothing less dignified than a sense of entitlement. But he says it in a much more articulate way than I just did. And I think people can if they look up Travis on Facebook, you'll find that video. In fact, after you and I hang up today, I'll I'll post it on my coach's page for people and they can go look at that. But that video went kind of viral. I think it got more than a million views or something like that.
Wow.
Some of the jiu-jitsu magazines picked it up. But yes, and you're absolutely right. It's one of the most important things you can teach your kids, and it's one of the most important things you can teach your students.
Yeah, I saw that talk. I thought that was amazing, man. I really think that was one of those taboo talks where people don't want to talk about that. And it's almost like by him saying that, it let out a lot of voices from a lot of parents who did want to say it, but they didn't want to be the first person to say it.
Yeah.
They want it to be like, well, I don't want to say, it's not their fault, or, I want to make excuses for them because it makes me feel good and it makes them feel good. And it sugarcoats the whole thing.
Yes.
Talk about what that does mentally to a child into adulthood and what that can do if they haven't experienced that early in childhood and they start to experience that in martial arts in their adulthood. What does that do to them mentally?
It creates a cycle of failure is what it does. And it creates a sense of entitlement. And like I said before, and some of this is cultural, but I don't think there's anything less dignified than a sense of entitlement. We all know when we see those kids who have that sense of entitlement, you don't want to raise kids that you end up not liking. And so it's really important that that you teach them early on to deal with failure. Look, jiu-jitsu, you're a black belt. Yeah. How many thousands of times did you have to tap out to another person to get to where you're at now, right? 10,000, who knows, 20,000. Mm-hmm. It is impossible, literally impossible to get to where you're at right now without doing that. Nobody's done it. Nobody will do it. You cannot learn jiu-jitsu and not lose over and over and over again. And that's why, in many ways, jiu-jitsu is so valuable. That's why the black belt has a meaning to people in jiu-jitsu. That's why it matters more than a martial art where that's not necessary. And after 3 years or 4 years of attending class, somebody hands you a black belt. And it's like that with everything. It's like that with anything that's meaningful, whether we're talking about a career, we're talking about running a business, we're talking about successful relationships, right? You're going to push yourself. You're going to try and bring the best out of yourself. And you're going to try and bring, if you care about people, you're going to try and get them to take as much personal responsibility as humanly possible and to step up into a position where they are by definition going to fail because they're trying to push themselves to see how far they can go in any given endeavor. And so if you don't teach people how to deal with failure, you're setting them up for real failure, for failure where they really don't ever accomplish anything, and for being miserable human beings.
I agree with that. Talk about how if a parent has never experienced failure before in their life, and then their child sees the way that their parent handles failure, they model what their parent does. And why is that so important that their parent also learn how to deal with failure too?
Yeah, it just gets passed on. It's the same thing with jiu-jitsu, and I haven't always been the best example of this, but it's one thing, we all know it's one thing to talk about how to roll, how to relax, how not to be worried about losing, how to handle it when you do lose. You can talk about that to the end of the day, but then when you get tapped out, you throw your water bottle across the room, right? or you spend the rest of your life dodging the person that tapped you out, people are going to pay a lot more attention to your actions than they are your words. And so it is with parenting. So, my kids see me fail. My kids see me fail all the time. And I put them in positions every single day where they fail. They're going to fail on their schoolwork. They're going to fail on their tests. They're going to fail at jiu-jitsu. And I'm there for them. I put my arm on them and I tell them I'm proud of them no matter what, assuming they actually gave it their best effort. But I'm never going to make excuses for them. I'm never going to tell them it's somebody else's fault, no matter what it is, because I know what that does to people in jiu-jitsu, does to students. I know what it does to people in day-to-day life. To me, that's actually the acid test for how people treat other people. It's like, are you willing to tell somebody else something that's different from what you tell your kids, right? So, for example, I would never allow my kids to box. The only way I'm going to allow one of my kids to be a boxer is if it was like the dying, like they just inside they had to box. That's the thing they wanted to do, right? But other than that, I wouldn't want them to box. I would steer them away from MMA. You know, there's only a few people like Conor McGregor and a few others who make money at MMA, and you wind up getting hit in the head a lot and you get brain damage. If they really wanted to do MMA, I'm not going to ban it, and I'll be there for them, but I'm not going to ever want to push one of my own kids into that. And I definitely wouldn't push them into boxing, which I think is much, much more unhealthy. So why would I do that with students? If somebody walks in my door and I'm pushing them to take a fight, or I'm saying, yeah, you got to put the gloves on, you got to really bang, is that something I'm going to say to my son or my daughter? Of course not. So, but unfortunately in society, you can look around and we tell other people how things that we would never say to our own kids. And we accept behavior from other people that we would never accept from our own kids. And some people do it in the name of compassion. And all I see is hypocrisy.
Yeah. Yeah. It's almost like the coddling analogy. You know, you coddle too much, and then the person doesn't know how to do it for themselves, or the child later on doesn't know how to do it for themselves. Not that you're not there for them. You are there for them when they know that you're there for them. They want to be able to go out and do it themselves.
Yeah.
Oh, those are excellent points, man. We are going to end, but before we end, I ask everybody this. This is my question at the end, because I have a course coming out called the Black Belt Mindset course.
Cool.
And Matt, to you, what does it mean to have a black belt mindset?
I think having a black belt mindset is having a mind and a body that has gone through a lot of failure, that understands that failure was necessary, that understands that failure was valuable, that understands the only way you ever accumulate or you ever gain a skill in something that's tangible, measurable, and meaningful is through that process, that you can't fake that process. You can't fake the results of that process any more than you can fake being able to speak a language or being able to play a guitar. And when the belt represents that, then it's meaningful. And when the belt doesn't represent that, then it's worthless.
That's a good note to end on. Thank you so much for joining us today. At the end of the talk, this is going to be posted on both of our timelines. Can you take that video that you talked about and post it in the chat?
Yes, I will do that for sure. And as soon as we hang up, I'll see if I can find it and I'll post it on my coach's page.
Man, thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you, Charlie. It was a pleasure.
Take care.
Bye-bye.